Hi, everyone. Welcome to the GoldFish Report. I'm your host, Louisa. Today is Friday, November 22nd, 2019. This is a special edition, a special report on the assassination of JFK, which we do every year. And here joining me to present this thorough analysis is my special guest, my esteemed colleague, my McKnight Professor Emeritus and retired Marine Corps officer, my friend, and the most dangerous mind in America, Jim Fetzer. How are you, Jim? Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Louise. On the 56th observance of the assassination, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to review the evidence we have amassed through collaborative research, which I began in a serious fashion back in 1992. What happened at JFK, who was responsible, and why? The official account tells us that a lone demented gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository building, scoring 2 hits and killing the president while wounding Governor John Conway. Here you can see Dealey Plaza, where the event took place. I'll just note some significant buildings: the County Records Building, the Dow Tax, the Book Depository itself, the grassy knoll area, the wooden fence. This area will turn out to be important. The triple underpass as well. As I explained, how we know that the official account was a complete fabrication. We have to begin with more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit. 2 Secret Service agents, for example, were left behind at Dealey Plaza. They would have run beside the presidential limousine or ridden on the back for protection. The motorcycle escort was reduced to 4. They were instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels. The officers themselves thought this was the most absurd formation they'd ever been asked to participate in. It turns out that they didn't cover the streets. Well, they didn't cover the windows. Notice open windows here. The crowd was allowed to spill out into the street. They didn't weld down the manhole covers. Here's a perfect illustration of the absurdity. Look at the crowd spilling out. Notice we have a bus here where an assassin with a handgun could have effortlessly taken out the president of the United States. Clear evidence that the Secret Service was not serious about protecting the president of the United States. Meanwhile, the governor himself was instrumental in organizing a change in the motorcade route. It ought to have gone straight up Main Street, but he arranged for a turn from Maine onto Houston, and then a 110-degree turn back onto Elm Street, a violation of Secret Service protocol, which precludes any turn greater than 90 degrees. This appears to have been to slow down the motorcade without alarming the occupants. In essence, they were taking the target into the kill zone. Most tellingly, all the vehicles were arranged in the wrong order. You ought to have had the presidential limousine in the middle, preceded by the lower ranking dignitaries, the mayor, the vice president. Instead, they set the president right out front. And indeed, instead of having a relatively monotonous sequence of black limousines, typically Cadillacs, in this case, the vehicles were all different makes, models, and colors, so that the perps could know exactly who was where in the motorcade. At Parkland, you'll see a Secret Service agent took a bucket of water and a sponge and began to wash the blood and brains out of the back of the limousine, which was obviously the destruction of evidence right in front of the public. A limousine here, you can see the arrangement, jump seats. We had the driver, William Greer, sitting here. Roy Kellerman, the agent in charge, in the passenger seat. Nellie Connolly, the wife of the governor, on the left jump seat. Governor Connolly on the right. Jackie on the left with a huge bouquet of red roses. John Kennedy on the right. It was all set up where Jackie's red roses appear to have been a signal that she must not be harmed, as well as indicating the location of the target. A film was made by a fellow by the name of Abraham Zapruder using a camera with a strip of 16mm film. So you record down one side of the film, and then you'd have to take it out, flip it over, and record down the other side. So you'd have an A and a B strip. So if you wanted to view the whole thing, you'd have to have it developed, split, and then sprocketed together. Roughly, there ought to have been uh, uh, 4,166 frames on the 50-foot strip of film altogether. That would be both sides, or roughly 2,000 frames on a side. On the extant version, we have 487 frames, and how I will explain now. Massive edited removed at least 100 frames turning from Houston on to Elm, and then another 400 frames later on under highly unusual circumstances after the driver, William Greer, pulled the limousine to the left into a halt to make sure that JFK would be killed. John P. Costello, who has a PhD in physics with a specialty in electromagnetism, has done a brilliant job of demonstrating internal features of the film that prove that it was massively edited, albeit in a very sophisticated fashion. John estimates the film is technically about 98% perfect, but the other 2% give it away. Those who paid attention to the live coverage that day would have heard on the major networks reports of 2 wounds the president incurred that day, a shot to the throat that had been fired from in front, and another shot to the right temple that had created a massive blow up to the back of the head. These would be injuries the government would have to conceal, where those they would acknowledge were a shot to the back would actually hit about 6.5, 7 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column, and a shot to the back of the head, which did indeed actually take place while concealing the other 2 shots. Because if you put together the official account with what was actually reported on the major media that day, you would have concluded that JFK had been hit at least 4 times from multiple directions, and therefore that a conspiracy had taken place. Here's the extant Zapruder film, and I'll explain how it was edited. Take a look here. You'll see as the motorcade approaches, there's a big jump all of a sudden where you find the vehicle suddenly near the Stemmons freeway sign. This is because the driver swung out too widely and nearly hit a concrete abutment. Jack was actually hit twice in the head, minimally, once from the right front, one from the back, but they merged those 2 shots when they created the film, so that you actually had a violent back and to the left motion, which many students of the assassination have taken to be the strongest evidence of conspiracy, since it was indicative of a shot from the front, but the real evidence far more damning than the edited version, as I am going to explain. 487 frames, vehicle disappears. Abraham Zapruder claimed he began filming at the very beginning when the motorcade came into view and continuously until the vehicle disappeared under the triple underpass. When the film was printed in the Warren Commission supporting volumes, they reversed the order of the frames, so that you had 313, 14, 15, 16 ought to have been the sequence, but instead they reversed 14 and 15 in order to mitigate the back and to the left. David Lifton, a brilliant student of JFK, whose book Best Evidence I regard as the single most important ever published on the assassination, became aware of this deception and had his girlfriend at the time write to J. Edgar Hoover about the misprinting, to which Hoover responded and explained it had been a mistake in the printing, but obviously it was no mistake. Meanwhile, in a book entitled 6 Seconds in Dallas, Josiah Thompson, whom I once admired, presented the most important proof of a double hit, namely that Jack was first hit in the back of the head, slumped forward, and then Jackie eased him back up, and he was hit again in the right temple, which had been merged. Here you can see continuous in relation to the frames on the left, where you have the hit at 313. 313, but before the hit, between 312 and 313, you had Jack moving forward, which is all that remained of that hit to the back of the head when they merged the 2, and then the violent back and to the left motion. The first frames from the Zapruder, which the public had access, were published in Live, They broke the plate twice. This is unheard of in the history of American journalism, in order to revise the sixth note to make it claim that he had proof here of the direction from which the shots were fired, where the blood spray turns out to have been added, to have actually been painted in, and which disappears far too rapidly to have been bona fide, as in fact John Costello demonstrates. The graphs here, color code breaking down into red, green, and blue, demonstrates that the spray disappears within 3 frames or 1/6 of a second, which is a physical impossibility. Even if you had dropped a lead weight from JFK's tumble, it wouldn't drop into the car this fast. Scientists were also able to show the spray could not have been moving so fast that it shot right out of view before frame 314. Even if the blood could have, where would it have ended up? It would have gone all over the Conleys and the windows and interior of the limousine if it had sprayed forward. But a frame published only weeks in color showed no blood at all. As if this were not bad enough, when the government report on the assassination was published in 1964, another frame, 323, was published, which again showed no blood, just a huge bloodless wound in the president's head. Notice how clean is the back of the trunk. Actually, it will turn out this was just littered with debris in the president's brains, where Jackie actually is looking at a big chunk of Jack's skull and brain. She climbs out on the back of the limousine to find it. Here you can see how they obliterated the hole at the back of the head, a massive fist-sized blowout. Jackie looking in this frame, you can see that it's covered up, where we'll pursue that further as we proceed. There are internal inconsistencies. The head wound cannot be observed in early frames because, as I've just shown, it was blacked out. But when I reviewed later frames, I found you could actually see it in frame 374. Larry Rivera, who's done brilliant work on the assassination, discovered it's actually outlined by Jackie's white glove in even earlier frames. So here's 312. Notice you cannot see the blowout, the blackout, because it hasn't occurred. This is prior to the shot at 313. This is the merge of the shots from behind and from in front. At 314, they've already blacked it out. 315, it remains blacked out. 316, it remains blacked out. 317, it remains blacked out. Now, what occurred to me was that it might be they had spent so much time focusing on concealing the blood in early frames that it might be possible to discern in later frames. And here you can see in frame 374, as Jackie's climbing out after that chunk of Jack's skull and brains, you can actually tell the wound is visible in 380, 374, and 375. Here's a close-up. This pink is a skull extension of skull bone. When the frangible bullet exploded, it blew open a flap of skull, but here you can see the wound. It's a gray matter. It's shaped rather like a cashew. For those, this is in fact devastating evidence that the film itself is not even internally consistent. So here you can see before the blowout, after the blowout versus the frame. So they forgot, they overlooked and didn't conceal it. David Mantic, MD, PhD, who's the leading expert on the medical evidence, entered the National Archives for the first time in late 1992. We had a conversation in which he explained he believed he would discover evidence of a second shot to the head, but also proof that the autopsy x-rays had been altered. I told him that was great because that's what we were looking for either way. In fact, he found both. David, who has a PhD in physics from Wisconsin, Madison, and also an MD from Michigan, and who is board certified in radiation oncology, which is treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, applied a technique from physics known as optical densitometry to measure the amount of light that passes through the X-ray to calculate the relative density of the objects whose exposure to radiation created the image, and discover there was a region here, he calls it area P for patch, that had been created by either a massive double exposure or by using a material far too dense to be human bone to conceal that fist-sized blowout. So if you compare the area P with David with what I discovered in frame 374, you can see the very close correspondence between them, where a part of the wound is concealed by JFK's hair. Meanwhile, Larry Rivera discovered that Jackie was wearing white gloves, actually created a background against which you can see the enormity of the defect in Jack's head. Notice it ought to have been continuous against the glove. Here you have her left hand, here you have her right. There is the area of the defect outlined against her glove, where you can see how much of Jack's cranium is missing. Here is another characterization thereof. Larry has done completely brilliant work here. Here's a frame 343 blowout 3D enhanced with Blender, which is a computer technique for creating three-dimensional images. You can see the enormity of the defect there. The sign also was wrongly replaced. The comparison of photos at the location and dimension of the Stemmons freeway sign reveal it was replaced by misplaced images. It demonstrates the sign was placed into the revised film without taking into consideration the optical distortion of the camera's lens. Here you'll see what a properly placed would have had all these signs parallel, but notice the deception here at the end. Actually, this is also proof from the edge. John Costello was able to establish. The reason they did this was the Stemmons sign had a bullet hole, which was completely inconsistent with the official account. And when they replaced it improperly. Here you can see a GIF where the correct placement of the sign is shown against the way it was introduced into the film as a stunning, very conclusive proof of alteration of the whole movie in its present version. The all but motionless spectators provide another proof of alteration. Everywhere else on the motorcade, spectators were waving and cheering, but during this portion of the motorcade, they were virtually motionless, which appears to be explicable insofar as the foreground was taken when the pilot car passed. In other words, they used the techniques of optical printing and special effects, whereby you could combine any foreground with any background. They could have had Jack doing backflips had they so desired. Here are just a couple of indications of the enthusiasm of the crowds when Jack and Jackie were passing by. But notice here in the film, the spectators are not being responsive at all. I mean, this is the president and the vice president, the president and first lady of the United States. They ought to have been waving enthusiastically, where the explanation appears to be there was something there they did not want the public to see, so that they replaced what ought to have been the foreground with the crowd being responsive to Jack and Jackie with images that were taken earlier when the pilot car passed by. Just notice once again, looking at the image, and you'll see how the passengers, the bystanders remain completely motionless or virtually so. They're not at all responding, cheering, clapping, waving as they ought to have been. Very, very stunning, but far from the only proof we have of Zapruder film alteration. External inconsistencies. It turns out that when you compare the Zapruder film with the Nix film, was taken from the opposite side. In the Nix, Clint Hill goes further forward and Jackie goes further back than you see in the Zapruder. Here in the Nix, notice how Clint Hill gets up. He's actually in physical contact with Jackie, but you do not see that in the Zapruder. So here at the top, you have the Zapruder, here at the bottom, the Nix, where the Nix demonstrates that the Zapruder was edited to remove those frames, some of which remain in the Nix, where they were imperfect in the way they sought to edit all the whole movies. There were 6 or 8 that showed different aspects of the motorcade in and around Dealey Plaza. The witness inconsistencies are even more stunning. We had witnesses to the head wound at Dealey Plaza at Parkland at Bethesda. Here's a sampler from Robert Rodin's book, The Killing of a President. Beverly Oliver, Phil Willis, Marilyn Willis, Ed Hoffman were all present at Dealey Plaza, saw the president's brains blown out the back of his head at the location they're indicating with their hands. Dr. Robert McClellan, Dr. Paul Peters, Dr. Kenneth Salyer, Dr. Charles Carrico, Dr. Richard Delaney, Dr. Charles Crenshaw, Dr. Ronald Jones, Nurse Audrey Bell, all reported a blowout at the back of the head, which they observed up close and personal at Parkland Hospital. Also, we had Theron Ward, who was the justice of the peace, Aubrey Reich, who was the ambulance driver, reporting the blowout to the back of the head. And then from the autopsy at Bethesda, Frank O'Neill, and FBI observer Gerald Custer, the radiologists Paul O'Connor, Floyd Reeby, who were medical technicians assisting in the autopsy, all reported it. Most strikingly, during a book tour, we have Clint Hill himself talking about how he rushed up to push Jackie back down in the seat and lay across the back of her head, where he observed for the first time the fist-sized blowout at the back of the head. Even if Clint actually touched Jackie, the films don't show him pushing her into the seat, which is what he has maintained for 47, at the time, 47 years, now over 50. In his formal report dated on 30 November 1963 about the events of 22 November 1963, he reports, as I lay over the top of the backseat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw part of his skull with hair on it, which is consistent with frame 374, but not with frames 313 to 316. Indeed, since this record was Warren Commission Exhibit CE 1024, at least some of its members and staff had to have been aware of observation by the first person to observe the head wound, apart from Jackie herself. But even the Kennedy detail published in 2010 about the Secret Service performance in Dallas includes this sentence: and slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping, fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head on page 217. An observation of enormous significance in relation to the autopsy photographs and x-rays, as well as the authenticity of the Zapruder film. Indeed, when the acting press secretary reported the death of JFK, he pointed to his right temple, attributing the finding to Admiral George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, and observed it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, which, as we have already observed, would be widely reported on radio and television that day. Here's a diagram authorized by Dr. Robert McClellan of the fist-sized blowout. Here are diagrams that were done by Charles Crenshaw for me, which I included in my book, Assassination Science, published in 1998, like the other books I published on these politically significant events, brought together the best experts on different aspects of the case. Notice he not only shows the blood at the back of the head, but from the side, the enormity of the defect, which Larry Rivera confirmed by Jackie's white glove as a background. David Mandick had said he would discover evidence of a second shot to the head. Indeed, it's a distribution of metallic particles where the heavier traveled further from the shot that entered the right temple, a frangible or exploding bullet that shed up the shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium. There were also witnesses to the throat wound in Dealey Plaza at Parkland and at Bethesda. This is Dr. Malcolm Perry, MD, who'd perform a simple tracheostomy incision through the wound. It was a small, clean puncture wound. Dr. Crenshaw also diagrammed for me where he made a simple, straight tracheostomy incision, very clean. This man was an excellent surgeon, but where we find in photographs from Bethesda, in autopsy photographs that surfaced in the late 1980s, the wound has been enlarged to look much more like what might have been accounted for had it been a wound of exit. You can even see the lower part of the small puncture wound there. Meanwhile, here we have the most famous and significant photograph of the assassination taken by AP photographer James I. Alchant. The president is actually clutching his throat. He's already been hit by a bullet that passed through the windshield right here where the arrow, you can see a small white spiral nebula with a dark, right here, a small white spiral nebula with a dark hole at the center. We'll do a close-up. He's clutching his throat. In the background, there's a figure extending out from the book depository that many have believed was Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin. We have, in fact, been able to confirm that it was indeed Lee Oswald, as I shall further explain. Here in the background is the window to a broom closet for a uranium mining operation that was a CIA asset on the second floor of the Daltex, from which 3 shots were fired with a Mannlicher Carcano. These were the only unsilenced weapon intended to create the impression of the acoustical impression of only 3 shots having been fired. And here you see Lyndon Johnson's, this is the vice president's limousine. Lyndon Johnson's security is already reacting, even though Jack Secret Service are looking around as though they have no idea what's taking place. Here you can see a close-up of the small spiral nebula in the windshield. The Secret Service would later produce a different windshield with a spider-like crack that had been caused by a fragment from inside, from behind, in order to conceal the fact that there was a through-and-through hole in the windshield, about which there's massive evidence and can be no doubt. You can even see the impact in frame 225 of the Zapruder film. The mortician who prepared the body for burial told an investigator that in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of his head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column, which confirms the analysis we've been presenting here from the mortician Thomas Evan Robinson, who was actually also present at Bethesda Hospital when the physician in charge, James Humes, took a cranial saw to the skull of JFK and enlarged the wound. But because Robinson had been there and witnessed what took place, he knew what wounds had been present in the body before the alteration. Large gaping hole in back of the head, patched with, he thinks, a piece of rubber over it, thinks the skull was full of plaster of Paris, a smaller wound in the right temple. This was the entry wound. It created that blowout, the pinkish, the crescent-shaped flap of 3 inches that remained attached to the skin. Approximately 2 small shrapnel wounds were in the face he had to pack with wax. He discovered this when they began leaking embalming fluid. David Manick brilliantly inferred that these were caused by small shards of glass when the bullet passed through the windshield and cut Jack's face. A wound in the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the backbone, which of course is the shot that was fired from behind. Adrenaline glands and brain removed. Other organs removed and put back. No swelling or discoloration to the face, meaning he died instantly. Jack Kennedy was dead at Dealey Plaza. Here we have, however, the stunning reconstruction by the House Select Committee on Assassination, which reinvestigated the case in 1977-78 and released its report in 1979. They are claiming that the whole back of the head was just fine, but that there was a wound here. You can see in this diagram right at the top of the head, which is 4 inches higher than the physicians at Bethesda had located it. They had placed it here in this vicinity. The House moved it upward. This was really a stunning piece of deception. I actually asked Cyril Weck, who was on the medical panel, how they had gone from the enormous gaping wound that we find described with mathematical precision in the Bethesda autopsy report after Humes had finished enlarging the wound with a cranial saw to this small hole at the top of the head. And to my astonishment, he told me, I'll have to check my notes. Meanwhile, David Mandick has located where a chunk of occipital bone that was found in the grass on Saturday by a student, a medical student named Billy Harper, whose uncle Jack Harper was on the staff of Methodist Hospital, shared it with the chief pathologist there, A.B. Carnes. They identified it as occipital bone from the back of a cranium. They took photographs, which is known as the Harper fragment, before turning over to the FBI. Jack placed it, David Mandick placed it here at the back of the head, which is perfectly appropriate and consistent with the results of his optical densitometry study. It's remarkable that one physician after another at Parkland reported extruding cerebellar as well as cerebral brain tissue, including Dr. Crenshaw, Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Carrico, Dr. Perry, Dr. McClellan, Dr. Baxter, and Dr. Clark, who is the head of neurosurgery, all reporting extruding cerebellar tissue. So the cerebellum is a small compact part of the brain at the base. But what this means is we have three different conflicting reports. The small fist-sized, relatively fist-sized blowout at the back of the head seen at Parkland. You have the huge, enormous, and large wound from Bethesda described in the official autopsy report, though other witnesses reported seeing the fist-sized blowout before it was enlarged. And then we have the absurd contraction by the HSCA. If this is all you knew about the assassination, it was obvious there'd been a conspiracy and a cover-up. So JFK, as I have explained, appears to have been hit at least 4 times, once in the throat from behind, once in the head from behind, and twice in the throat and in the right temple. We had 60 witnesses to the limousine stop. Some saw it slow dramatically, others saw it come to a complete stop. The limousine slowed dramatically as it came to a complete stop. So it depends how much you might have been in a position to observe in your visual field. This was such an obvious indication of Secret Service complicity that it had to be removed. John Costello has done a collation of eyewitness reports about the assassination, which you can find at assassinationresearch.com, a website that archives research on the JFK assassination that John P. Costello and I co-edit. Dozens and dozens reported the limo stop. Some reported seeing it slow dramatically, some coming to a complete stop. Makes sense from different positions. Different witnesses would have seen it slow dramatically as it came to a complete stop. Among them is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. As Daniel Gallup has observed, Foster seemed to have no idea her recollections contradict the official record. Tony told Deborah, for some reason, the car stopped. It did stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped. And all of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why the car stopped. The way she delivers these lines, Gallup observed, I doubt Tony had ever seen the excellent Z film and had no idea her recollections contradicted the film. He said he was reminded of David Lifton's early 1971 interviews with the Newmans, who also said the limo had stopped. He had no way of knowing at the time the Z film showed no such stop. All of this is to say, the earliest recollections of individuals are likely to be the most significant, especially if there's evidence of a lack of exposure to contrary viewpoints that might influence memory. Here are a few more. Billy Lovelady on the steps of the book depository. He was standing near Lee Oswald. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly, who was their supervisor in the book depository, the car. I saw the president's car swerve to the left and stop somewhere down in this area. Mr. Bellin, who was questioning him. When you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop? Mr. Truly, it would be hard to say, over a second or two, something like that. I didn't see. I just saw it stop. I don't know. I didn't see it start up. Mrs. Earl Cabell, the wife of the mayor, 4 cars back. I was aware that the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped. Later, Mr. Hubert questioning her. That was when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Cabell, every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. Later, we were dead still for a matter of some seconds. Meanwhile, 2 witnesses on the opposite the grassy knoll, Mary Mormon and Jean Hill, saw it come to a complete stop. They were in the street at the time, but they're shown in the film as still on the grass. Asked by Noel Twyman, did a brilliant book entitled Bloody Treason, and consulted with Hollywood cinematic experts, in particular Roderick Ryan, why there was background blurred in frame 302. Notice the blur, but not blurred in frame 303. And Ryan explained the camera was panning the limo in 302, but not in 303 where it was stationary. On page 159, he added, He had shown it to his son, who's also in the film industry. He agreed it was moving in 302, but standing still in 303. Notice how sharp is the limousine and the motorcade, including JFK and his wife Jackie, the governor, that the features of the background are fairly precise. But notice the keyhole behind the front handle of the limousine. It's not blurred, which it ought to have done. The shutter was open about half the time in the camera. How far did the limo move while the shutter was open for this one frame? It should have moved this far, this distance in one frame. So either the limo and everyone in it, or the whole background and the man in umbrella in the foreground, or some combination two should be blurred this much. But obviously they aren't, because they were already that combining foregrounds and backgrounds in order to conceal what had actually happened. Here you see Mary Moorman and Jean Hill. Mary in the black was taking photographs with a Polaroid camera. Jean was coating them with preservatives. But both of them testified they were in the street when they took the photographs, even though, in fact, in the Zapruder film, they're still on the grass. Here's Jack White, who did brilliant work, noticing that Mary stepped off the curb before Jean did. Here he has a photograph where you can see the top of Jean's head, the top of Mary's head, where Mary's already in the street. Although this mixed frame is blurry when enlarged to this side, it's clear enough to show Mary's head, lower circle, is so far below Jean's upper circle that Mary had stepped off the curb before Jean did. Also note, she seems hunched over to take the photo instead of being upright as in Zapruder. Here's a very famous photograph that Mary Moorman took, where this is just a moment after Jack has been hit. In fact, it looks as though there's a chunk of his skull and brains right here on his shoulder. Jack White noticed that internal to the film is a line of sight, and that Mary's photograph had to be taken on this line of sight displayed here, where David Mantic and I went down with surveying equipment to test Jack's hypothesis and determined that Mary Moorman had to have been in the street when she took her photograph. One of the significant elements of which is in this vicinity here, is a figure of a shooter in a police uniform firing a weapon. There are witnesses to the other film. This is the film before it was edited, including Irwin Schwartz, William Raymond, Rich Della Rosa, Gregory Burnham. An associate of Abraham Zapruder, Irwin Schwartz, viewed the film in what appears to have been its original state at Eastman Kodak, where it was developed. Nearly 60 witnesses reported the limo slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt, as Vincent Palomar explained in a chapter of Murder in Dealey Plaza. When Noel asked him about the limo stop, he was vague and could not recall. But when Noel asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said he had seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left. He'd seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and it had blown out to the left and rear. Twyman pressed him on this crucial point, but Schwartz was emphatic. They make 4 important observations. The other film includes a turn from Houston on to Elm. It shows Greer bringing the limousine to an abrupt halt. During the limousine stop, JFK is hit at least twice in the head, once from behind and he slumps forward, once from the front and he slumps to the side. Greer watches the whole time, then hits the accelerator. Further consideration of the blowout to the left here comes from Secret Service agents such as Sam Kinney and Vincent Gullo Jr. Vince Palomar, the leading assassination expert on the Secret Service, wrote to Gullo to explain that Kinney had told him of his discovery of a piece of the right rear of the president's skull in the limousine during the flight back to Washington, D.C., and that another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine trunk. Gullo confirmed Kinney's statements to Palomar, saying he was totally familiar with the facts as Palomar outlined them. The motorcycle escort officers have provided invaluable additional proof of what happened here. During the limo stop, he was hit at least twice in the head. Officer Hargis, riding to the left rear, who'd been hit with the debris so forcefully initially thought he himself had been shot, dismounted his bike and ran between the cars to the grassy knoll. Officer Jackson, on the right, actually rode his bike up the grassy knoll. 5 Secret Service agents dismounted the Secret Service limousine and surrounded the presidential. So here you see the four motorcycle escort officers, Cheney, Jackson in the background, Hargis, and Martin. Here we have, this is right about the time that the stop has taken place. Hargis is about to dismount from his bike. According to this research that Larry Rivera has done, where he had access to the transcript that Fred Newcomb had conducted interviews in 1972, Larry transcribed them very painfully and discovered, based on their reports, that Hargis had parked his bike and run between the limos to the grassy knoll, which would have been impossible if there had been in motion, that Jackson had motored his bike up the grassy knoll until it fell over and he proceeded on foot. Meanwhile, 5 agents got out of the Secret Service limousine and covered the presidential, one taking a chunk of skull from a little boy and throwing it in the back seat. Notice here you see the impressions from the wheels of Douglas Jackson riding up onto the grassy knoll. And here you see Officer Hargis actually returning to his bike from having dismounted and rushed up the grassy knoll. Here's Hargis again, and you can see his bike parked there, none of which, of course, is in the extant film. Meanwhile, Larry Rivera has produced 2 brilliant videos, the JFK Horseman Part 1 and JFK Horseman Part 2, you can find on YouTube. How the switch was done. The 8mm all-ray split film developed in Dallas was taken to the National Photographic Interpretation Center on Saturday, 23 November 1963, where they had to have a shop owner open his store to buy an 8mm projector. The 16mm unsplit film developed in Rochester at a secret CIA lab adjacent to Kodak headquarters, known as Hawkeye Works, was brought to the NPIC on Sunday, the 24th of November, and replaced the original. The most brilliant work on this subject is done by Douglas Horn in his volume 4 of his Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, where he reconstructs in detail exactly what happened, why it had to be fixed. JFK was hit at least 4 times in the back from behind, in the throat from in front, and at least twice in the head, once from behind and once from the right front. There were at least 6 shooters who fired from 8 to 10 shots, possibly more. As I've explained before, we can see the small spiral nebula for the shot from in front. You can see the figure in the doorway, and more about how we know it was Lee Oswald. The window of the Daltex from which those 3 shots were fired with an unsilenced weapon. So the actual shooting looked much more like this. We had a first shot fired from the top of the county records building that hit Jack in the back. You had a second shot fired from what I originally believed was the opposite side of the grass, but where we now know it was fired from inside the triple underpass. That's a bullet that passed through the windshield and hit JFK in the throat. Then we have the shots being fired from the book depository, not at JFK, but at John Connally, in the mistaken belief that it was Ralph Yarborough, a liberal Texas senator whom JFK despised. There was a huge argument that morning between JFK and Lyndon Johnson, where LBJ was trying to get Connally out and Yarborough in, but JFK overrode him on the ground that the chief executive of the state should ride with the chief executive of the United States. The easiest shot was fired here from the grassy knoll with a pistol, but it would have harmed Jackie. So the shot was slightly pulled and it wound up in the grass here, picked up by a lieutenant for the Dallas Police Force. The shot that entered the right temple was fired from this location, the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence, so that it really was a turkey shoot. The first shot, which hit Jack in the back from the top of the county records building, appears to have been fired by Dallas Deputy Sheriff Harry Weatherford. He used a 30-06 to fire a Mannlicher Carcano bullet fitted with a plastic collar known as a sabot, which hit JFK 5.5 inches below the shoulder, just to the right of the spinal column, or 6.5, depending how you measure it. This was a shallow wound with no point of exit. According to researcher Penn Jones, Weatherford was a crack shot, was on top of the Dallas County Jail building at the time of the assassination. A researcher had once asked if he had shot JFK. Weatherford replied, "You little son of a bitch, I shoot lots of people." Jones also wrote that a custom-made silencer for a rifle had been delivered to Weatherford a few weeks before the assassination. Jack Lawrence, a U.S. Air Force expert who'd gone to work for the automobile dealership that provided the vehicles for the presidential motorcade, just a few days from the assassination, fired the shot that passed through the windshield and struck JFK from the throat. Originally, we thought from the south end of the triple underpass, but Gary King, Larry Rivera, and I have gone to the location. There's a perfect location inside the triple underpass where there's actually a metal electrical connection box that would have perfectly fit a weapon. There was a fold-down new model weapon that he appears to have used, which he seems to have received by way of Curtis LeMay, one of the few who had possession of such a weapon, which would have let Jack Lawrence know that he was acting under the control of his superior, Curtis LeMay. Meanwhile, Nestor Tony Escadro, an anti-Castro Cuban recruited by the CIA, fired the shot that hit JFK in the back of the head after the limo was brought to a halt. He fired 3 shots with 2 misses using a Mannlicher Carcano, the only unsilenced shots fired from the Dow Tex, which housed the Uranium Mining Corporation, Dallas Uranium and Oil, that was a CIA front. There's even a statue to him in Freedom Park in Little Havana in Miami. I mean, astounding. If you ask someone why there's a statue to this obscure figure, they might tell you he took care of business. Meanwhile, one of the misses hit the windshield over the chrome strip above the windshield. There you can see the impact there. Another missed and hit a distant curbing and injured James Tague. You can see a scar on his face from a chunk of concrete that blew up. A second shot appears to have been fired by Weatherford that actually missed by a considerable margin, but left a mark in the vicinity of a sewer opening. Meanwhile, Roscoe White, a Dallas police officer with ties to the CIA, fired from the grassy knoll joining the motorcade, but seemed to have pulled his shot because it would have hit Jackie, so his shot went into the grass. His son subsequently discovered his diary, but gave it to the FBI, and it's not been seen since. We know more about Roscoe. This was a serious guy who appears to have been the body double for the backyard photographs, as Larry Rivera has revealed, and may have been responsible for assassinating as many as 50 witnesses. Meanwhile, Malcolm Mack Wallace, who shot from the Dallas Book Depository, appears to have murdered a dozen people for Lyndon. Mack appears to have fired from the west side of the book depository at Texas Governor John Conley in the mistaken belief he was Senator Ralph Yarborough, whom LBJ despised. Wallace's fingerprint was found on one of the boxes in the assassin's lair in the book depository from which Oswald allegedly fired. Frank Sturgis, later complicit in the Watergate robbery, who also appears to have been connected to the CIA, appears to have fired from the north end of the triple underpass, the shot that entered JFK's right temple. Sturgis is known to have ties to Meyer Lansky, a notorious crime syndicate kingpin, and confessed his role to a New York City Gold Shield detective, Jim Rothstein, when he was arrested attempting to kill Marita Lawrence. I've discussed this with the detective Rothstein. Fascinating story. So who shot the alleged film of the assassination? Jack White has serious doubts it was done by Abraham Zapruder because, for example, Zapruder was standing on top of this low colonnade, allegedly with his secretary, Marilyn Seitzman. But as you can see here, Seitzman was in some places in front of Zapruder, which would have made it impossible for him to film. Another indication that Zapruder was involved in this is when he gave an interview that night on television. He used his hand to indicate there'd been a blowout at the right front. That would be the story that would be presented after the film was edited, but not one, as we have seen the other witnesses reported, the blowout to the back of the head, which hit Officer Hargis right to the left rear. So I believe Zapruder has implicated himself in the cover-up. Because the figure in the doorway is fought with anomalies. Notice here his left shoulder is missing, for example, and this figure named Black Tie Man appears to have been introduced. It was wearing a richly textured black and long sleeve, very worn shirt. Marina has, by the way, subsequently reported having remembered washing the shirt. The height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt were the same as the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt Lee Oswald was wearing when he was arrested. The Dallas police were so aware of the striking resemblance, they had him remove his outer shirt and only did the mugshot in the t-shirt, evidence of consciousness of guilt. In terms of the backyard photograph, this was all staged very thoroughly to try to create a single image where you had Lee Oswald holding the Mannlicher Carcano with which he's alleged to have shot JFK, a revolver with which he's supposed to have shot Officer J.D. Tippit, and holding two communist newspapers, The Worker and The Militant. So here you had the motive and the means, and of course, by being at the book depository, he had the opportunity, according to the official account, where this photograph was used to implicate him, to incriminate him in the minds of the public. Jack White realized those newspapers had known dimensions and therefore could serve as an internal yardstick to determine the height of the individual who was photographed in the backyard. And it turns out that using that yardstick, the individual was only 5'6" when Lee was about 5'10", or alternatively, more likely, when they introduced the newspapers, they introduced them just a tad too large. Jack White also noticed that although no two handheld snapshots should mask, Oswald's face is a complete exact match. When shown one of these photographs by Will Fritz, a homicide detective investigating the case, Lee said that was his face pasted on someone else's body. That he knew something about photography, and with time he'd be able to prove it. Well, Lee didn't live long enough, of course, but but Jim Mars and I have done a study. Jack White also proved it. And here's an observation from the head of the HSCA, Michael Babb. If the backyard photographs are invalid, how they were produced poses far-reaching questions in the area of conspiracy, for they evince a degree of technical sophistication that would almost necessarily raise the possibility that someone conspired not only to kill the president, but to make Oswald a patsy. Actually, that was from the head of the House Select Committee when they reinvestigated. Notice you have different chins. Lee had a rather pointed chin, but in the backyard photograph, it's a block chin. And there's an insert line between the lower lip and the chin. We have discovered that Roscoe White had a block chin and also had a funny lump on his right wrist, where the individual in the backyard had that funny lump on the right wrist and, of course, had the block chin. Larry Rivera has subsequently confirmed that it was indeed Roscoe White. Here was a ghost image found in the desk of a Dallas detective claiming he was only trying to see if it could be done, but obviously the Dallas police were very much involved in framing Lee for a crime he did not commit. Here he returned to the area of the doorway at the book depository where you see the figure extending out. Fascinating. This is the arrest report on Lee Oswald, which was filed at 1:40, which is significant since the arrest didn't take place until 1:50. This man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and police officer J.D. Tippit. He also shot and wounded Governor John Connally. They knew how to get their man. In fact, according to the official account, Lee Oswald, who was actually heading for the Texas Theater to meet his handler, took a deviation on 10th Street, went way out of his way to shoot Officer Tippit, which is completely absurd, but which they needed to frame him for shooting the officer. Meanwhile, if you do a close-up, you can see lots of anomalies, not only the missing shoulder. Here you have a face that's been obfuscated. Here you have a figure with his hands raised, but his face has been blacked out, so we call this man Black Hole Man. Notice his shirt has actually been obfuscated. That turns out to be for very good reasons. Billy Lovelady, who was a co-worker with Lee, said he thought it was very odd that he and Lee would be confused since he was 2 to 3 inches shorter, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, and was wearing a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt the day of the assassination. The FBI actually called him in on the 29th of February and photographed him wearing the shirt he had worn at the time of the assassination, which they acknowledged here in their report to J. Edgar Hoover. He stated he was wearing a red and white vertically striped shirt and plus jeans, and they actually took the photographs you just seen. Larry Rivera has done superpositions on Lee using both images of on the man in the doorway, using images of both Lee Oswald and Billy Lovelady. Here you can see the image of Lee, where the man in the doorway, the features fit Lee Oswald exactly. The ears, the eyes, the nose, the chin, they're all exactly right, confirming that indeed we were correct. Our assessment based on the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt, that it was Lee Oswald. Here we have the facial features being those of Lee Oswald as well. Whereas if you compare that with Billy Lovelady on the right, you can see it's all wrong. The ears are wrong, the nose is wrong, the jaw is wrong. It was clearly Lee Oswald and not Billy Lovelady. Meanwhile, Larry also confirmed that Billy Lovelady was the man with his hands raised whose face had been obfuscated. So you can see here the black hole man turning into Billy Lovelady. They did a lot of moves here to obfuscate the photograph. This is a reconstruction by Richard Hook that I regard as quite brilliant, where they took the image of a woman with a child and shifted it around to get the black tie man here. They blacked out black hole man and did the obfuscation, as you can see. Here is Larry's reconstruction of what it would have looked like had it been proper and in color, where you can see Billy Lovelady standing out in his red and white vertically striped shirt. This is very much closer to the photograph taken by AP photographer James I. Alchin. Ralph Sinkay has done brilliant work. We were very concerned with the timeline at which the Alchins was first photographed, because the allegation was made it was already published the day of the assassination. But the fact is it wasn't published until the following day, which allowed alterations to be made. And what Ralph Sinkay discovered was they even made up fake editions of newspapers. This one from the News Palladium, this was the actual real edition published on Friday, which was replaced by a fake edition to support the claim that the photograph, the Alchins, had been published already the day of the assassination. This is the power of the CIA. Speaking generally, to understand the assassination of Jack Kennedy, which was a highly complex operation, you have to differentiate between the sponsors, the facilitators, and the mechanics. The sponsors included the CIA, where Jack was threatening to shatter them into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs, who were disillusioned with JFK, who had not invaded Cuba contrary to their unanimous recommendation, who'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union contrary to their unanimous opposition, and was now pulling our forces out of Vietnam, where they believed a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. Anti-Castro Cubans who'd been misled to believe that Jack had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs, which was not the case, but which the agency allowed them to believe, since it was the agency who had failed them. The mafia, Jack, with Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General, was bringing more indictments and prosecutions and convictions than ever before in history. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed, where Jack had had the Department of Treasury print United States notes in the belief that it was absurd for the American government to pay interest to a consortium of private banks to publish the currency of the United States. Our so-called national debt is really the result of compound interest owed to this consortium of private banks for printing the currency of the United States, which is obviously absurd. Texas oilmen were upset because Jack was threatening to get rid of the oil depletion allowance, which was a massive tax write-off that got on the ridiculous ground that since oil was a finite resource, by pumping it out of ground, they were putting themselves out of business in Israel. Jack was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, a founder and the first prime minister of Israel, who wanted Israel to develop nuclear weapons, which Jack was opposed in the belief it would ignite a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Ben-Gurion resigned in disgust over this issue, but it appears not before he designated the Mossad to participate in the assassination of JFK. The facilitators, Lyndon Johnson of the assassination of J. Edgar Hoover of the cover-up, and the mechanics, the shooters, their supervisors and coordinators, whom many will be astonished to learn included George Herbert Walker Bush and Edward Lansdale. Just to focus on the facilitators. To truly understand what happened, you have to go back to the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960. Lyndon Johnson was also running for the nomination to be president of the United States, where John Connally was his campaign manager. Jack Kennedy, winning the nomination, invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate, but gave him overnight to think about it. Bobby, in the meanwhile, went by the Johnson suite to extend a pro forma invitation to Lyndon Johnson, never imagining he'd be willing to give up his position as a powerful majority leader of the Senate. Instead, to his surprise, Lyndon jumps on it and even threatened to expose that JFK had Addison's disease, which meant he was not expected to live a long, healthy life, that among his many dalliances were some with women who were spies for East Germany. And moreover, he told Bobby that if he were not on the ticket, that any legislative proposals coming down from the White House would be dead on arrival, because in his position as majority leader, he would bottle them up. Jack and Bobby were boxed in, couldn't figure out a way out of this, and had to accede to Lyndon's demand he be on the ticket. When one of LBJ's wealthy supporters discovered this was happening, he burst into the Johnson suite, cursing and swearing, because now Lyndon was going to help JFK become president. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby would later declare in public that JFK would not survive his first term and that he would die a violent death. And Lyndon would send his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. I got to know one of the participants in the assassination, the third of the three tramps, Chauncey Marvin Holt, who actually was there with Charles Rogers and Charles Harrelson, who's actually a hitman for the mob and the father of actor Woody Harrelson. I believe they were going to be backup patsies. Well, what's most important here is this figure walking past them as they're being escorted. This turns out to be Edward Lansdale, an Air Force general who was responsible for assassinations all over the world, including in Vietnam. So we not only have Lansdale walking past, we have a photograph of George Herbert Walker Bush in front of the Texas School Book Depository, and we have a photograph of Lansdale waiting to speak to Bush. Any number of us, including Mike Sparks, who's quite a brilliant guy, have concluded that the sequence of shots and the positions of the shooters was determined by Edward Lansdale. As far as G.H.W. Bush's participation is concerned, Richard Hook has done brilliant work on the shooter in the Dow text, and it appears that we not only had Nestor Escadro, Tony Escadro firing, but behind him was George Herbert Walker Bush, who was supervising the hit team. Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig reported to Jim Garrison he knew of 12 arrests made in Dealey Plaza that day. One in particular was made by R.E. Vaughn of the Dallas Police Department, of a man coming out of the Dow Tex who said he was an independent oil operator from Houston, Texas. The prisoner was taken from Vaughn by Dallas police detectives, and that was the last he saw of him. No mugshot, no interview, no fingerprints or name is in existence of this mystery man. Independent oil operator from Houston, however, was always George Bush's CIA cover. Exactly why was he arrested? Garrison reported the man came running out of the Dow Tex, and authorities could hardly avoid arresting him because of the clamor of onlookers. He was taken to the sheriff's office for questioning, although there is no record of it. Meanwhile, other CIA officials were at the corner of Houston and Maine paying their last respects. You can see photographs of them here. They included Grayson Litch, Eddie Bayo. This is, in fact, not David Morales, who was involved in the assassination, but someone who looks a great deal like him. Ted Shackley, Rip Robertson, Tracy Barnes, all stunning evidence. Meanwhile, the claim has been made that there couldn't have been a conspiracy, but because no one talked. But Noel Twyman laid that to rest in a single page of his brilliant book, Bloody Treason. The question has been asked many times, If the killing of Kennedy was a conspiracy involving many people, how could it possibly have been kept secret all this time? Why hasn't somebody talked? The answer to the question is simple. A lot of people have talked. The talking started before the assassination, continues to this day. Many examples. Carlos Marcello bragged in front of Ed Becker that Kennedy would be killed and described how it would be done. Santo Trafficante Jr. bragged that Kennedy would be killed. Joseph Miltier, right-wing nut, bragged that Kennedy would be killed and how it would be done. Johnny Rosselli, Sam Giancana's right-hand man, told Jack Anderson years later that Ruby was their man and was ordered to silence Oswald. David Atlee Phillips, suspected of being the mysterious Maurice Bishop and perpetrator of the multiple Oswald, said before he died that fringe elements of U.S. intelligence may have been involved. Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeline Brown, with whom I had over 100 conversations, by the way, has said Lyndon implied before Kennedy was killed it was going to happen, and actually acknowledged afterwards. Maurita Lawrence, CIA contract agent, stated in depositions for a courtroom trial Frank Sturgis told her he and a group of anti-Castro Cubans had been involved in the Kennedy assassination. Sam Giancana's brother, Chuck, revealed in the book Double Cross, the brothers, that his brother, Sam Giancana, confessed that he was involved in the crime in 1966, but it also involved Chauncey Holt, Charles Harrelson, Jim Hicks, Jack Ruby, Billy Saul Estes. There's a mountain of proof. So if you look at the alternative conspiracy theories, there are many that can be eliminated because they are not consistent with the evidence. In fact, it was a coup d'etat involving the CIA and the other parties I've identified, where if you notice, the identity of the shooters I've given, it appears that each of the sponsored had put up a shooter. And we've now identified a seventh shooter who appears to be the Israeli hitman who is in the plaza. And there's yet an eighth shooter at the grassy knoll, opposite the grassy knoll. So Noel Twyman summarized it brilliantly in his book, remember, published already in 1997. I saw the most perfect combination with the greatest probability of success with CIA, military, Secret Service, Mafia, LBJ, Hoover. But with LBJ and the conspiratorial group Hoover could possibly have been relied upon and to fall in line because the Mafia having compromised him. Not only that, but LBJ would become the most valuable because he'd become president and have immediate authority over the entire executive branch, including the Secret Service, the military, the CIA, and the FBI. This represents the entire investigative and prosecuting capacity of the United States government, with the possible exception of congressional investigating committees, where Lyndon preempted them by forming the Warren Commission and designating J. Edgar Hoover as the primary agency for investigation. We even have a refutation of the official government account in the New York Times paperback edition, where you can see the entry of the bullet in the back of Jack, roughly where it actually occurred, was too low to have exited his throat, but also have hit Conley. Moreover, once you understand what really happened, you understand there was a malevolent force behind the death of JFK. His name, Lyndon Baines Johnson. For those who want more, my most recent book, JFK, Who, How, and Why, is still available at moonrockbooks.com. But you might want to move fast because it might not be available much longer.
Jim, that was amazing. Thank you very, very much. What's very eerie about everything you described, like especially the last quarter, the last third of your description, talking about the motivation, talking about the players, the facilitators, is the fact that we're repeating this right now. President Trump is doing the same thing, draining the swamp, as JFK was trying to do with getting rid of the CIA and the mafia and the Federal Reserve. And we're trying to get rid of the Fed and trying to, print. We already have a new U.S. Treasury note. It has not been officially announced, but it is already printed, and it will be gold-backed, folks. So we are going to have a transition to a new. This is what JFK did not finish. This is what he attempted to do. He was trying to do the same thing that our president today is trying to do. and we need to protect our president. We need to pray for him and make sure that he can succeed in this mission, because what happened was JFK underestimated. Wouldn't you say it's a fair characterization, Jim, that JFK underestimated those enemies?
Oh, yes. JFK would later reflect and say he would have been better off had he made Bobby the head of the CIA instead of Attorney General. And I think that's 100% correct, because the CIA was clearly complicit in plotting. Lyndon Johnson was a mastermind behind the assassination without any doubt. In Phil Nelson's book, LBJ, Mastermind of JFK's Assassination, lays out the evidence in such a powerful way. I doubt anyone who actually reads even the first few chapters could have any doubt about it.
Jim, this was an amazing, analysis and examination of the evidence. It obviously, with beyond the shadow of a doubt, establishes there was a conspiracy to kill our president that hasn't really been that people should be outraged about. If anyone has at this point still have any remaining questions about this, you really there's no hope for you. But the most critical factors you evaluated: the video manipulation discrepancies, the autopsy manipulation discrepancies, the eyewitness discrepancies, the assassination, though not into great detail of how all, but you have in other reports talked about the effort made by the CIA to go to all the film developing studios and remove all of the film, all the photos that were developed of the
FBI. Yeah, the FBI had agents stationed at all the photo and film developing labs in Dallas for 2 weeks, and they would take any photographs or films related to Dealey Plaza and leave a little card. Richard Trask, in his book Pictures of the Pain, actually shows the little card they left, and in most cases, the photographs and films were never returned.
Okay, sounds like Las Vegas, doesn't it, Jim? So anytime there's any kind of false flag, event, there's always some control of the immediate, surroundings, the logistics. You also went through the whole Lee Oswald hoax, the fact that he was a patsy, the weapon evidence and analysis, the media collusion, and the propaganda that was then, pushed onto the to the people. You went over who had the motivation to do it. Clearly, Lee Harvey Oswald had no motivation to kill the president. This is a ridiculous theory to think that that someone like him could pull off such a sophisticated attack like this. Only the CIA could do something like this. And of course, the fringe elements within the U.S. intelligence is absolutely correct. As you stated, this was a coup d'etat to remove Kennedy because he was doing good things. He was trying to get us back onto a gold standard. He was trying to end the Fed and remove the corruption within the government that President Trump is trying to do today. And that's why they hate him. And if anybody does not believe this propaganda, and if you're still a Democrat, I feel sorry for you. I truly do. If you're believing the propaganda that the Democrats are putting out there, then I feel sorry for you that you're not smart enough to figure this out, honestly. But you've been deceived, and I'll give you that. But look at the analysis Jim has presented, and if the CIA was doing this 56 years ago, folks, you imagine what they're doing to us today. So this is really it's as relevant today as it was 56 years ago, Jim. Isn't that right?
Oh, I agree completely. Yes. The very same institutional interests that undermine and assassinate JFK are undermining and seeking to character assassinate Donald Trump today.
Not just character assassinate him, literally assassinate him.
That's true as well. There have been over a dozen. The most recent appears to have been a time delay poison that actually got by his food tester, but who subsequently became seriously ill, and it may have, in fact, been attempted before.
I wonder what the snowflakes think of a presentation like this, Jim. What do the snowflakes think about the fact that the government conspired, that there was a rogue element within the government, a shadow government, not the whole government? I'm not anti-government whatsoever. I'm anti-corruption, which is what Trump says all the time. And he's a very passionate man. If you listen to his interview this morning on Fox News, you would have no doubt this is a man who lives his convictions. So, there's no there's he's living he's a very passionate about doing the right thing and cleaning up the corruption. Jim, this was a massive amount, and thank you for acknowledging all your other collaborators and contributors and researchers who you quote and you cite for your work as well. And this was really an incredible analysis of the assassination of our 35th president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. So, Jim, thank you very much. As always, on this day, it's a somber remembrance is what it is. It's sad that we have to remember him on this day rather than on another kind of day. But, Jim, thank you for presenting this to our viewers, and we're going to get this published immediately.
Well, I can't thank you enough for the opportunity, Louisa, because those who ignore history are destined to repeat it.
You're absolutely right, Jim. Thank you so much for this work and for joining me today. And to our viewers, don't ever let this, never forget. Never forget, and please share this with people who have a hard time believing that conspiracy theories are actually conspiracy facts. And let's not forget, this is one of the greatest conspiracies of our time. And to think it's ended there, think again. So, folks, thank you for viewing. Let's remember our slain president today, and let's make sure we never let this happen again. Thank you for viewing. This concludes this edition. Oh, by the way, and thank you so much, Jim, again, for this hard work and for joining me. And so this concludes this edition of the GoldFish Report.